This is Culture Shock.
Hello, I'm psychologist Dr. Jeff Gardere, and welcome to Culture Shock. Our guest today is psychologist Dr. William R. Coulson. He is the man responsible for putting psychology into the public school classrooms nationwide.
And I'm psychotherapist Dwight Bain. When you think of the words Jonesboro, Pearl, Paducah, Littleton, what have we wrought in our culture that has us stunned and reeling at the violence that we're seeing in school shootings across the country? Was it the guns? Was it Hollywood? Or was it TMP? Too much psychology.
TMP? Dwight? Well, Dr. Coulson, I want to thank you for joining us here today. But I do have to share with the audience that I am incensed by Dr. Coulson's opening remarks. That's right. Mental health care in the schools is as important as the textbooks. Tipper Gore said that, Bill. What's wrong with that statement and that sentiment?
Well, it just, I mean, what's her qualification for saying it? That's one thing. But let me tell you how this whole problem...
That's hitting below the belt there.
Let me tell you how the problem began.
Okay.
Abe Maslow, back in 1943, wrote this in an
psychologist
article.
Abe
The famous
Maslow, yes.
Psychologist Abe Maslow. Clearly, he wrote, if psychotherapy could be tremendously extended, if instead of dealing with a few dozen patients a year, psychotherapists could deal with several million, this would force all kinds of political, legal, economic, and sociological changes as well. And that's what's happened, and it's not been good. We're becoming a nation of illiterates.
But was he going for positive change? Is that what he was talking about?
He wanted to put everybody in touch with the source of authority within their own feelings, and that turns out to be a mistake. When you do that to adults, maybe it's not so bad, but when you turn on children and start picking on them in this way, it doesn't work out well for the culture.
That's interesting that you say picking on them as if it's something that we're trying to ram down their throats.
Well, think about it, Jeff. It is something that's being rammed down their throats. If I'm 7 years old and I'm sitting in the second grade and I'm minding my own business and someone comes along and says, how do you feel about what your mom and dad say? And if I'm always encouraged to express and deal with my feelings with no sense of absolute, no sense of right or wrong, and perhaps even the suggestion, sometimes even more than the suggestion, that my parents are full of mud, then I'm 7 years old. I'm going to say, hey, I've got my rights. I'm going to do it my way.
But isn't that in many ways, an exaggeration? Because when we work with a 7-year-old, we may ask them to go ahead, talk about your feelings, but we don't say, but just go ahead and do anything that you want, which includes probably trying to hurt someone else.
Well, when you carry it to that degree, when we think about it, if you say, express your feelings, but I take absolutes out, I take morality out, I take values out, And
what psychologists have you been working with that will give that sort of a speech? Yeah, go ahead and talk about your feelings, but we will remove all of these things, including morality.
Jeff, this one. In the 1960s and the 1970s, you were involved in a social experiment that said, let's take that morality out. Tell us about it.
Well, we wanted to see what would happen. We called it Therapy for Normals, and we put little kids through this program. And Dr. Rogers later wrote about it. Carl Rogers, the other famous psychologist in my own personal history, he called it the working process of therapy. And this is what he declared he saw over and over again, and I did too. As it goes more deeply, it can bring great personal pain and distress, experiences of frustration, distrust, anger, envy, despair, self-depreciation. So as a simple empiricist, a person who's paying attention to experience, I have to say it was not a good idea to do it. Too much psychology, indeed.
But aren't we looking at a population where perhaps we're bringing this up with the Columbine, the tragic Columbine shootings? We're saying, well, the psychology didn't work because there was psychology there. But in fact, there are many schools, many kids who have benefited from the psychology, who have perhaps been part of screenings where they found out that they have learning disabilities or some sort of dyslexia and have been able to help them. What about those benefits, gentlemen?
Well, I have to say that they're more than offset by the ones who died, including the two shooters at Columbine. You know, they took 4 classes together, these boys, Klebold and Harris. The 4 classes were bowling, creative writing, video production, and guess what? Psychology. And I'm convinced that they were exposed to the psychology of Abraham Maslow, the one that I quoted back in 1943. Toward the end of his life, Maslow expressed certain regrets about what he had created. He said that it had become only dramatic, the outcomes of these therapy sessions, only dramatic, orgasmic, transient, peaky. He means peak experiences, which is another one of his terms. Peaky, like a moment on the top of Mount Everest. I think of April 20th, 1999, as a peak experience for those boys.
But I really do wonder whether the peak experiences, Dwight, come from psychology, or do they also come from the fact that these kids were exposed to many influences, including the video games, including being in a school where they were considered to be outcasts, part of that trench coat mafia.
They may have been, but Jeff, we're going to have to hold that thought, because in just a moment, we're going to come back on Culture Shock and talk about Eric Harris, the shooter at Columbine High School. He was on medication and he was seeing a psychiatrist. We're going to find out what really happened with some behind-the-scenes information. Stay with us.
Get your kids out of the line of fire, because all of this psychology, this TMP, this too much psychology, is very dangerous.
Police do their job, they arrest the bad guys, they bring the bad guys to the courthouse, and the liberal judges look at them, tap them on the back of the hand, and let the bad guys back on the street. We have crime in America increasing higher than it ever has been, and I'm telling you, liberal judges are a huge part of that problem.
And as always, you're looking for the scapegoat, so now it's the liberal judges. Well, I'll tell you, from my experience working in the court systems, there aren't any liberal judges. There are judges who look
Culture shock. To educate a child in mind and not morals is to educate a menace to society.
And welcome back to Culture Shock. Barbara Walters, anchoring ABC's Nightline, reporting on the Columbine tragedy, said Eric Harris was taking an antidepressant drug and seeing a psychiatrist. Perhaps there's another explanation for his behavior. Well, what really happened to Eric Harris, the cold, calculating shooter at Columbine? Bill, I know that you were in Littleton, Colorado recently. You saw some behind-the-scenes stuff. Tell us what you discovered.
What I discovered is that they're considering strongly giving more of the same treatment that, in my opinion, led to the problem in the first place.
Which was what kind of treatment, Bill? What were they doing there?
Well, they were giving a lot of amateur psychotherapies. What they're giving, we called it back in the 60s when we came up with this idea, Rogers and Maslow and I, we called it the facilitation of learning. Rather than authoritative teaching on matters of fact, we decided to turn the chairs into a circle and to get the kids to talk to one another about their experiences.
You mean to be able to communicate with one another?
Communicate with one another. And you know what happens when you do that, Jeff? It's the experienced kids who take over the class. Those who are already trying drugs, those who have already had sex, become the authorities in the class, and the inexperienced youngsters who might be on a fast track toward academic success want to get caught up with the experienced kids. So you have a greater tendency toward violent deeds, among other things.
But Bill, isn't the purpose of some sort of a group therapy to be able to share the experiences in the group, perhaps the ones who have been involved in sex, the ones who are taking drugs, to be able to share that experience with the others, to keep them away from there, to steer them in the right direction?
May I bring you back to your senses? We're talking about public education. My purposes for going to school is not to share about my feelings or who I had sex with the night before. It's to learn something about history and science and biology and English.
Don't you think, Dwight, that kids are talking about this anyway?
Of course they're talking about it anyway.
Do it in a group setting where there is a facilitator, at least it can be more positive.
Is it my taxpayer dollar responsibilities to pay for kids to talk about their feelings in school? No. It is my responsibility to somehow train children to be prepared for life. Part of that may be social interaction, but a bigger part is understanding rules, order, a sense of what I'm going to call a moral code of right and wrong, or at least to learn from societies that didn't have that. We call that history. If you don't learn from history, you repeat it every time.
It doesn't get more positive. The research indicates that it gets more powerful precisely because it's now being done under the aegis of the school. When the kids are meeting on the playground and sharing their experiences, that's one thing. But when they do it